The live-action Batman TV show launched on January 12, 1966 on ABC. It was watched by almost half of the total television viewing audience at the time, making it one of the most successful television debuts ever, and the second episode managed to increase that market share. The series lasted for 3 seasons with a total of 120 episodes. Initially it ran twice a week, one of only 2 shows at the time to have such a schedule, and all the stories were told as 2-parters. The first part always ended with the heroes in some dreadfully absurd peril, a classic cliffhanger structure. Although ratings declined sharply by the end of the 3rd season, at the peak of Batmania, the show had inspired a feature-length 20th Century Fox movie and a whole raft of merchandise, including a couple of genuinely bizarre pop singles.
Will tonight be the night that Bruce reveals himself to the magnificent Miranda?
I never met a girl like you before, Miranda. I'd do anything for you if you just ask.
Miranda.
Ask me to do anything for you, Miranda. But please don't ask me to remove my mask. It's against the code of heroes.
So, for over 2 decades, from 1966 till the release of the 1989 Tim Burton Batman movie with Michael Keaton, Adam West's Batman was the Batman for most of the public. But the show was not universally liked by comic book fans. Many did not appreciate the way it seemed to make fun of their hero, and by the 1980s, the prefaces to more than a few Batman graphic novels go out of their way to repudiate this influential take on the character. Frank Miller's introduction to his work with David Mazzucchelli, Batman Year One, is merely the most cited example. If your only memory of Batman is that of Adam West and Burt Ward exchanging camped-out quips while clobbering slumming guest stars Vincent Price and Cesar Romero, I hope this book will come as a surprise. For me, Batman was never funny. Miller here provides a vivid instance of a widely held attitude that has circulated for decades now in debates around Batman's value, in which a dark and serious take on the character is evoked as the definitive version, more faithful to the original comics, positively contrasted with other approaches which are seen as parodies, spoofs, or worse, corruptions of the original Batman essence. Miller's seemingly irony-free tone also reveals the problem with this strategy. The serious determination to avoid silliness at all costs can easily be made to seem a bit silly. To insist that Batman was never funny is, in the end, humorously humorless. It's an attitude that almost cries out for parody, or, to put it another way, it makes me just want to read that last line in my most gravelly Batman voice. For me, Batman was never funny. The makers of this little mashup clearly feel the same way.
Darkness. No parents.
But efforts to construct the Batman TV show as an aberrant deviation from the serious Batman of the comic books don't actually hold up to scrutiny. The truth is that several of the earliest episodes of the TV show are remarkably faithful adaptations of the comics of the period. And at this point, I'm going to ask you, if you have not watched the required episodes of Batman for this module, to please go to Canvas and watch the first one now. It's called Hi Diddle Riddle, and I promise you won't regret it. Apparently, when producer William Dozier was asked if he would be interested in the show, he bought and read a selection of Batman comics. At first, he was baffled at the thought of how to translate them to TV, but in a conversation with writer Lorenzo Semple Jr., the two men came up with the idea of following the comics as closely as possible, because that would be hilarious. Consequently, the first episode of the series was based on this story, starring the Riddler, from Batman 171. The script is remarkably faithful on certain points, even using the exact same riddles, for example, or recreating this scene in which Batman sees the Riddler through a window and thinks the villain is committing a hold-up when he's actually engaged in a legitimate transaction and merely holding a cigarette lighter in the shape of a gun. Here's the same short sequence from the show for comparison.
Got him red-handed. Watch it, chum. Put us in safety.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
Hold it, Riddler.
Even the funniest moment of this TV sequence, the elaborate business at the window, emerges not so much from mocking Batman, but taking the process of being a crime fighter too seriously. So we get this absurdly drawn-out sequence involving gadgets, including a hook for the security bars, and a message about pedestrian safety. This careful, painstaking attitude is then comedically reversed as the heroes smash through the window in a cavalier fashion. Not only was the show sometimes very faithful to the comics, it was also an influence upon them. The Riddler again makes a good example. He was not actually a popular Batman villain. This comic book represented what was only his second appearance since the 1940s, and if not for the TV show, he might never have returned to the comics again. As it was, however, actor Frank Gorshin imbued the character with such gleeful, manic energy that he suddenly became one of the more exciting regulars of the Rogues Gallery and has remained one of Batman's more popular nemesis to the present day. In fact, Paul Dano has apparently been cast to play him in the forthcoming Batman movie with Robert Pattinson. So far from being a fundamental deviation from the comics, the TV show not only hewed close to the comics, but would prove to be an influence on them in a way that continues to influence the movies today. This process is an important reminder that when considering the success of superhero franchises, we are almost never looking at a process of one-to-one adaptation from comics to cinema, but a more complicated transmedia feedback loop. The Batman TV show was swiftly designated as an example of a camp artwork in numerous newspaper articles of the period. But the strong overlap between the comics and the show suggests that those comics might already have had a touch of camp about them, though it's an open question as to whether they were examples of what Sontag calls naive camp or deliberate camp, something she discusses in notes 18 through 23, and we can perhaps talk about this in our discussions. But before we do so, we should consider the question of why critics at the time saw the sensibility of the show as camp, rather than as merely goofy or as simple parody. Looking back at Sontag for inspiration here, we might note her observation in note 16 about the double sense. The idea that the camp sensibility is one that is alive to a double sense in which some things can be taken. The producers of the TV series were certainly alive to this concept. It's clear from several statements of William Dozier's that from the beginning he saw the show as having a double address that would allow it to reach two putatively different audiences, adults and children. The overt structure of the show was that of an old-fashioned Saturday morning action-adventure movie serial, with brave heroes pitted against nefarious villains, fast-paced action, and regular cliffhangers, a formula that had originally been designed with younger audiences in mind. Overlaid on top of this, however, was a knowingly self-conscious humor that relied for its effects on the ability of the audience to recognize the situations as inherently ludicrous, and that even dared to subvert the idea of the noble, hypermasculine American hero by ironizing him, or, in Sontag's phrase, by placing him in quotation marks. As the critic Will Brooker has written, it is never possible to guarantee that the authorial meaning of any text will be echoed by the audience interpretation, but in this case there was a remarkably good fit between Dozier's stated intention and the manner in which the show was received by both critics and audiences. Any number of reviews could be quoted to make the point. Time reported that while children took him seriously, adults were supposed to see Batman as camp, while the Saturday Evening Post claimed that Batman-watching families with 8-year-olds in them are torn with dissension because of the "daddy stop laughing" problem. The dual address, which invites us to see the show as working differently according to whether we adopt the perspective of an adult or that of a child, suggests other seemingly opposed ways of reading Batman that are actually simultaneously present in any given episode of the show. The knowing versus the naive, or the experienced versus the innocent, the clashing values of high and low or elite and popular culture, the presumed distinction between the serious and the playful, or the literal and the metaphorical, the apparent division between presentism and nostalgia, and of course the supposed opposition between the straight and queer. But the nature of a simultaneous address that allows us to read first in one way and then in another is that it can, in the process, blur these supposed distinctions. Perhaps one of the most interesting ways that the Batman TV show exemplifies a Sontagian vision of camp, however, is through the emphasis on being as playing a role. This is particularly apparent in the tendency to cast major stars of the era, such as Vincent Price, Tallulah Bankhead, George Sanders, or Milton Berle as the heroes of the series, in distinct contrast to West and Ward, who were unknowns prior to taking the roles of Batman and Robin. The thrill for the knowing audience was not so much that this week the villain was Catwoman, but rather that this week Catwoman was Eartha Kitt. As Matt Yockey writes, the casting of recognizable guest stars, in contrast to the casting of West and Ward, indicates another way by which the show deployed a camp aesthetic. The audience's awareness of the celebrity identities of the guest villains is itself a constant wink at the audience. Furthermore, when the identity of the actor comes to seem more important than the character they are playing, this can have the additional effect of making the viewer feel closer to the performer, and at the same time more aware that what they are watching is a performance. This camp approach to casting, placing quotation marks around every performance, is perhaps best realized in the episode or episodes featuring Liberace, apparently also the most watched shows of the entire series during the original broadcast. First, however, the inevitable advance of cultural amnesia might require me to say a little bit about Liberace himself. He was a well-known celebrity between the 1950s and the 1980s, and in fact, for a time, was the highest-paid musical entertainer in the world. He first became known for his 1950s TV show, which combined the traditional elegance and repertoire of the world of classical music with more popular elements such as boogie-woogie, a spectacular flamboyance of performance style, and a kind of folksy sweetness, epitomized by the broad smiles with which he would favor the camera, however moving or dramatic the music might be. This 3-minute clip from the show will give you a good sense of his early style and, of course, his genuine technical brilliance as a pianist.
I'm very happy to be with all of you nice people again. And today my program is inspired by the letters I received from some of you folks who say you like the classics best of all, and others who prefer the popular music on our program. And I hope that our program today will please all of you, because it's music both classic and popular. And to start with, here is Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee and its popular counterpart, the Bumble Boogie. Thank you very, very much.
As his career took off, Liberace began to take his stage act to more and more extravagant heights of camp in terms of his outrageous costumes and jewelry. Liberace never came out publicly and even successfully sued a couple of newspapers for printing articles implying that he was gay. But his status as a camp icon was well established by the time of his Batman appearance, which, among other things, subverts the conventions of heterosexual romance while making sly allusions to Liberace's popularity with women. And again, at this point, if you've not yet watched the 2 episodes of Batman featuring Liberace that are required for this module, please go to Canvas and watch them now. They are thoroughly enjoyable. Okay, so as you will have seen, in the show, Liberace plays not one but 2 roles: the high camp character of Chandel, and his aggressively butch twin brother Harry, who is the real villain of the piece. Both characters are given scenes that are themselves marked as performances within performances. As Chandel, in the first episode, Liberace has a scene in which he must perform the conventions of heterosexual wooing, marked as false not merely by the expressions on his face, but the use of props such as root beer instead of champagne. In the second episode, Liberace plays a scene in which Harry must pretend to be Chandel, pretending to woo Harriet.
When that awful explosion happened, they were enlarging a photograph of me.
Sweet Harriet, please don't engulf yourself in foolish guilt. Control yourself. Listen to me. I have a proposal to make.
A proposal?
Holy heartbreak. How can he at a time like this?
I propose to perform a memorial concert at Gotham Town Hall tonight.
Strange. Hardly the proposal I expected.
Oh, Maestro, how generous of you.
Do me a great honor. Appear with me on stage and sing some sweet song in your incomparable voice.
Oh, yes. I know just the thing.
Wonderful, dear Harriet. Drop by my dressing room at 7 and we'll rehearse a bit. Until tonight at 7, farewell. Adieu.
Alfred! Oh, Alfred!
You called, madam.
Alfred, will you please bring me a tiny glass of blackberry brandy?
Begging your pardon, madam, but this unprecedented request for strong spirits, is something amiss?
It's not amiss, Alfred. It's a nightmare. That man who was just here is an imposter. He was not Chandel.
Dear me. How bizarre. Are you certain, madam?
Oh, yes, Alfred, I'm quite certain. When a man whom I know, as well as I know Chandel, gives my hand a kiss. Well, Alfred, there's an old saying. A girl can tell.
So, here we have a camp icon, Liberace, pretending to be the macho twin brother, Harry, of a camp supervillain named Chandel. Harry is in turn pretending to be Chandel, and Chandel is in turn pretending to participate in a heterosexual act of courtship. This head-spinning nesting of performance within performance puts the very category of authenticity in question, which is one reason why it's all the more funny that Aunt Harriet declares that she can tell the difference between Chandel and Harry by a mere kiss on the hand. The idea of sincerity here is not mocked so much as it is placed at such a distance that we have a whole new category of performance, acting not as mimesis, but as pure theatrical gesture, not as imitation, but as the reproduction of previously established convention. When Liberace pretends to be Harry pretending to be Chandel, what we end up with is Liberace pretending to be Liberace. Now this sounds like a tautology, but it's more like a paradox. Most actors will attempt to offer a performance that aspires to the condition of truth, taking up roles that mimic reality to some degree. Performances that recreate an already well-known person are usually singled out for special praise. But in Batman, Liberace does almost exactly the opposite. He offers a performance that aspires to be recognized as a performance, taking up a role that also happens to mimic the role that he has always played, himself. This is not acting as imitation, but acting as being, or in Sontag's phrase, being as playing a role. Now, there's a lot more we could say about the Batman TV show and camp, but I'll reserve further discussion for our meeting next week. In the meantime, I'll close with a couple of questions and suggestions. First, I should credit some sources. The Batman TV show is still frequently discussed and analyzed by media scholars and historians of television, as well as by comic book enthusiasts. And if you're curious to learn more about this pop cultural artifact, then I particularly recommend Matt Yockey's small but super smart paperback, which is simply called Batman, as well as the chapter on pop and camp in Will Brooker's excellent book Batman Unmasked. Both of these fine critics have influenced my own thinking on this subject. Second, I want to raise a version of the question that I raised in my last video regarding whether camp was a historical phenomenon, to ask whether the same is true of a camp Batman. It's still possible to make Batman funny. Lego Batman is a case in point. But to what extent is Lego Batman also camp? And if not, why not? Third, I want to encourage you all to take a look at some of the other examples from the Batman TV show that I've placed on canvas, and to interpret them through and against Sontag's notes on camp, to think of additional ways that we might read this TV show as a camp classic. And finally, just because I can, and because I'm sure it would have delighted him, I'm going to end with a bit more Liberace. Here's one of my favorite 2-minute clips from his 1950s TV show. I hope you enjoy it, and look forward to talking with you all next week.
Hello, everyone. I certainly do appreciate your wonderful welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to open my program tonight, ladies and gentlemen, with a very exciting little composition by Khachaturian. It's called The Saber Dance. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.